Back, America. Hugh, joined by United States Senator Tom Cotton, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's the author of this brand new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. For the next 7 weeks, I'll be doing a chapter a week with Senator Cotton, involving as well news as it breaks. Just so happens. Senator, welcome. Good to have you.
Hey, Hugh. It's good to be back on with you. Yeah, thank you there for noticing that 7 Things You Can't Say About China will be coming out, I think, in just 2 weeks from tomorrow.
And I have the advanced copy, and I love the fact that you call it a techno-totalitarian state. And I also love the fact that it's timely. President Trump announced a 10% tariff on China. I hope it goes higher. It is the one that is producing the precursor chemicals that are killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. And there are lots of reasons not to like China, but let's just start there. The tariffs are long overdue, and I hope he raises them.
Yeah, Hugh. There's no question about that. I write about it in 7 Things You Can't Say About China. I write at one point that one of the things that you can't say about China is it's coming for our kids. You can see that through TikTok. You can see in the way it manipulates secondary and post-secondary curriculum and influences our education. But you can also see it in what I call the reverse opium war, that China has basically been waging a reverse opium war against American kids now for decades. Sending fentanyl itself into Mexico to the drug cartels for many years, and now lately sending in the precursors to fentanyl so they can deny sending fentanyl itself. It all gets back to China waging a reverse opium war as if American teenagers were responsible for what British colonialists did 170 years ago.
Now, Senator, when you put this out there, I'm sure the Chinese Communist government's not going to like you very much, but you recount in Chapter 1 the slow-motion genocide against the Tibetan people, the fast genocide against the Uyghurs, the repression of Hong Kong. It is the persecution of Christians, of Falun Gong. There just isn't any doubt about it. It's a Leninist totalitarian state, and I don't think there's any doubt. Does anyone still try and argue like we did for many years when Deng Xiaoping had faked us?
Oh, sure, Hugh. Many of China's toadies in corporate America or in the influence industry in Washington, on college campuses in Wall Street and Hollywood, still try to say that it's not really communist, it's not Marxist-Leninist, it's reformed. I mean, this is the way the entire establishment sold the soft on China policy going back 40 years, that if we would just help China, get wealthy, send our jobs and our factories there. As China liberalized economically, they would liberalize politically. We now know that the exact opposite happened. We funded the growing wealth and military of maybe the most formidable enemy we've ever faced in our history, and they've gotten even more repressive. And with advanced technology, they have become not just a totalitarian nation, but a techno-totalitarian nation, given control over its own people and the ability to torment its people that Soviet Russia never had. And that first chapter in 7 Things You Can't Say About China is the most fundamental thing, which is that China is an evil empire. And you can never forget that China is an evil empire when you're looking at all the other things you're not supposed to say about China, that it's preparing for war, that it's waging economic world war, that it's infiltrated American society, and that most alarmingly, China could win. If we don't take the threat seriously.
We will go through one at a time over the next 7 weeks, but I do want to pause on one story that illustrates how crafty they are. They got TikTok and Gen Z and Gen Alpha hooked on it, and there are economic downsides to if it's not being sold, being shut down, but it will be shut down if it's not sold. However, they announced DeepSeek a week ago today, and it became the most downloaded app in the United States. I guess we're just dummies. And I chewed out, I lost it in my class. It's like inviting a spy to come in and live in your house.
Yes, indeed. The announcement of DeepSeek and the supposed amount of money it costs and the supposed amount of computing power it required, I think, is very suspect and fishy. I think it calls for careful scrutiny. It also, though, immediately highlights some of the things we've been talking about from 7 Things You Can't Say About China. Ask DeepSeek what happened in Tiananmen Square.
Yes.
Ask it about the Uyghur genocide. Ask it about the Tibetan genocide. Ask it about Falun Gong. And it'll either give you no answer or it will give you propaganda. And that's the exact problem that China has with anything like artificial intelligence, is it has to crack down to maintain control over the information that is always exerted over its own people. And I just think in the end, that's going to make it hard for China to beat us in this realm. Not impossible, but harder, but not for lack of trying.
And finally, Senator, you mentioned in the introduction, you were talking about COVID being manufactured in a lab early on this show. I think in January, if not then February of 2020, you were the first to the ramparts on this. Does anyone note that when they talk about 7 things you can't say in China? Or is it too early to say because the book doesn't drop for 2 weeks?
Well, yeah, the book hasn't dropped, but I do think with the CIA's recent conclusion joining the FBI and the Department of Energy's intelligence unit that COVID almost certainly originated in those labs in Wuhan, as opposed to, I don't know, happening from a bat kissing a aardvark or something in the food market in Wuhan, that's going to be a renewed source of interest. And I think the real question becomes, not who is right and who is wrong, but rather what are we going to do to hold China accountable for it?
Now,
this is just one more crime in the long litany of crimes that Chinese communism has inflicted on the world.
Now, you know Senator Rubio pretty well now, Secretary of State Rubio. He's the acting head of AID. He said they're going to run it the right way or shut it down. What do you think about that? I'm all for it, but Senator Rubio, what do you think? Will he follow through on this?
I do. I do think it's important to have such a high-profile, politically accountable person acting at AID. There are things that AID does that advances our national interest, but there's a lot it does, Hugh, that does not advance our national interest. In fact, we're counter to our national interest, and there's a lot that's just inherently wasteful. A lot of money that gets spent on bureaucrats and nonprofits in the AID nonprofit industrial complex, if you will, that never gets to a single person in need all around the world, and certainly not in any strategically beneficial way. So I think there could be substantial, sweeping reforms at AID under President Trump that will actually make sure our foreign aid dollars, to the extent we're spending it, helps countries that are pro-American where we have strategic interests.
Last question.
Wasted.
Why did we send $886 billion to Afghanistan last year?
I don't think it was $1 billion as a view. That's the size of the Department of Defense. $1 million?
Yeah, it's billion. Oh no, it's 886 million. I'm sorry, it's 886 million.
That is a good question that I suspect Senator Rubio will work on getting to the bottom of. And I think a lot of that money was rushed out in the days after the election as well. Again, it's just another example of how so much of the money that comes through AID, if it gets beyond the pockets of its own bureaucracy or its NGO complex, doesn't really go to support America's interests abroad.
Well, you were right. It's only 886 million. I like to be correct. Senator Cotton, thank you. We'll be talking about 7 things you can't say about China